I greet you in the name of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. The days of lockdown are passing fast, and we are more than halfway through, if it only lasts until the 16th of April. This week's focus, Holy Week, is on the personalities of the men who are involved in capturing, hearing, and the crucifixion of Jesus. Yesterday, Tina spoke about Thomas. Today we are focusing on Caiaphas and then Pontius Pilate and Judas. As background of Caiaphas, we need to understand a bit more about Jerusalem and the role players in the time of Christ. Anna had been the high priest from 6 to 15 CE. The Romans had removed him from office, yet he still had considerable power behind the scenes. 5 of his sons succeeded him as high priest. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest who was in office at the time of Jesus' ministry. Annas was still called high priest, even though he was not serving in that capacity at the time of the crucifixion. Nothing much is known about Caiaphas' earlier career, but we can assume that he was a member of a very wealthy family because he was married to the daughter of Annas. Annas and Caiaphas may have sympathized with the Sadducees, who were a religious movement in Judea that found most of its members among the wealthy Jewish elite. In 18 CE, the Roman governor Valerius Gratus appointed Caiaphas as high priest in Jerusalem. The two men must have had an excellent working relationship because Caiaphas remained in office exceptionally long. Gratus' successor, Pontius Pilate, retained the office as high priest, retained the high priest Caiaphas in office. The appointment of high priest in Israel goes back to the Old Testament, where Aaron was the high priest firstly appointed by God. Aaron played an important role in history in the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and in the plagues. He was the spokesman of Moses. The high priests were also distinguished from priests by wearing more magnificent clothing. The role of the priest in Israel was to stand in the middle between God and the people of Israel. The priests had thus an intermediate role and a twofold task. Firstly, to teach the law, and secondly, to bring sacrifices to God. The priests were to make known the laws, ways, word, and commands of God to the people. Israelites who had sinned could bring an animal to the sanctuary and slaughter the animal. The blood of this animal would then be thrown onto the altar by the priests, and the worshippers' sins would then be atoned for. In addition of these tasks, the priest's prime privilege was to bless the people of Israel in the name of Yahweh. As a high priest, Caiaphas would have overseen the sacrifices and other practices that were performed regularly at the temple in Jerusalem. Especially important would have been his role on the Day of Atonement, when he, and only he, would have entered into the Holy of Holies to seek God's forgiveness on behalf of himself and the entire nation. As a priest in the era of 6 CE, when Judah came under the direct Roman rule, Caiaphas would also have been subject to the authority of the Roman governor, who had the power to appoint a high priest of his choosing, and also to take into custody of the high priest's magnificent and valuable sacred garment when it was politically expedient to do so. As a high priest who served for many years under 2 Roman governors, Caiaphas would have likely been experienced and skilled at walking the fine line required in order to serve the people without unduly angering the Roman governors. Caiaphas was also the leader of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish ruling body or council in Jerusalem and was headed by the high priest that was charged by the Romans' authority by maintaining the law and order amongst the Jews. The Sanhedrin functioned as a highly judicial authority of Israel. The Sanhedrin contained members of the Sadducees and Pharisees, along with other prominent members of the Jewish community. As the highest authority representing the religious establishment in Israel, the Sanhedrin, under the leadership of Caiaphas, played a prominent role in the final conflict that led to the crucifixion of Jesus. Caiaphas had predicted the necessity of the death of Jesus. In Matthew 26, 3 and 4 we read, "Then the chief priest and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him." In John 11 we read, "By one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation do not perish.'" Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest of that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not only for the nation, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who was scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. He was the one who plotted to kill Jesus. Custom dedicated that after the temple guards had arrested Jesus, he should have been locked up in the temple stockades until such time that the full Sanhedrin could hear his case. This is exactly what happened to Peter and John and other apostles upon their arrest. John states that Jesus was first questioned by Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, as he head of the Annas family was probably considered a leading authority on religious matters. Following a brief hearing, Jesus was then referred to Caiaphas. Matthew 26:53 reads, "Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled." So Jesus was then taken directly to Jerusalem's residence of the high priest, Joseph Caiaphas, chairman of the high court. This was highly unusual for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was the eve of Passover, one of the holiest nights of the Jewish liturgical calendar, when the high priest and other priestly officials would be expected to celebrate the festival with their families, rather than adjudicating a case of a rural rabbi from Galilee. Secondly, while Caiaphas' residence was probably quite comfortable, if not luxurious, it was unlikely that his home would have been large enough to accommodate the full quorum of 72 members of the Sanhedrin, even assuming that these members would have followed themselves to be summoned on such short notice. The hastily organized indictment of Jesus as described in Mark's account, which would form the basis of all subsequent Gospels, was conducted under a cloak of darkness, which suggests that Caiaphas was eager to dispense of Jesus as soon as possible, and to do so behind closed door, without the full support of the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas was facing a very difficult situation. Without the full backing of the Sanhedrin, a high priest did not have the power to single-handedly order a man's death. The only other option that he had was to refer the whole matter to the local Roman government. This would be a very controversial move because over preceding decades, the Sanhedrin had fought hard to retain autonomy in domestic matters without any interference from the Roman authorities. The other and even more fundamental problem was that Jesus was only guilty of disturbing the peace and perhaps blasphemy in the temple forecourt. But neither of these warranted Roman intervention, let alone a sentence of death. Why did Caiaphas then order an immediate hearing of Jesus' fate at his own residence? One answer could be that Caiaphas wanted to preempt any more violent demonstrations, like Jesus' attack on the money changers, which could undoubtedly have provoked Roman forces. Other motive might have been that Caiaphas expected the Pharisees' faction of the Sanhedrin to come to Jesus' defense. The Gospels attest that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, both members of the Sanhedrin, were in sympathy with Jesus' teachings. Caiaphas' fear was not unfounded, and some months later, when Peter and the apostle were brought before the Sanhedrin, the noted Pharisee Gamaliel defended them and ultimately secured their release. And to make matters worse, the indictment hearing, as described by Mark, did not go according to plan. The various eyewitnesses did not agree. "We heard him say," one said, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made by hands," as according to Mark 14. Inflammatory rhetoric perhaps, but hardly grounds for persecution, because countless other prophets in the Hebrew scriptures had said the same thing, warning that Jerusalem's temple would face imminent destruction. Let's read from Matthew 26 from verse 59. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days." Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not coming to any answer? What is this testimony of these men that are bringing them against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under the oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said it," Jesus replied. "But I say to you all, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do you need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He is worthy of death." This is the word of the Lord. This is what Caiaphas needed to hear. He knew that the Romans had no interest in the minutes of Jewish exegesis, but words like the right hand of the power would get their attention. The high priest tore his clothes and said, "Well, do we still need any witnesses?" In his view, Jesus has incriminated himself. Because Jesus would not or refused to refute the accusation, the high priest handed him over to the Roman authorities, which found him guilty of treason. Caiaphas, the high priest, felt stuck. He felt really stuck, trapped in his responsibilities. He felt as though the very weight of the world was on his shoulders, that he couldn't move, he couldn't enjoy life, he couldn't do anything because he was stuck in this tremendous responsibility. For one thing, Caiaphas felt stuck in responsibility just for maintaining the institution. He had to do a job, and he knew that he must do it well. He had to maintain the temple institution. There really wasn't any time to ask questions or to worry about why and what the temple has to be maintained. Nor could he worry much about the temple's mission or what it was, what the priorities were. The job was just to keep it going. He could have spent all day and every day seeing that the building was clean and the bills were paid and the program was carried out. He had also to keep peace in Jerusalem. He had to lead the Sanhedrin, and he could not fail his family and Annas' expectations. What a responsibility. Caiaphas, this night, felt stuck, felt captured. The job was not made easier, by the way, by that Jesus fellow who had swept through the temple the other day with his whip and his rhetoric about the den of thieves. Business had not been back to par since. Just how was anybody supposed to maintain the temple if the revenues were cut off? Just how would the bills get paid and the system was disturbed? The figures just didn't add up. Too much was going out and too little was coming in. And you know what they say, that if the outgo exceeds your income, then your upkeep will be your downfall. Caiaphas was upset about Jesus and his challenges to the institution. Jesus. What a problem this Nazarene had become to Caiaphas. Who would have thought 3 years ago, when reports began to filter in from Galilee, that one preacher should become such an issue? The man was strange, sure, but it should have not made so much ripples for him to wander around those little never-to-do-well villages, talking about loving God and loving your neighbor. There should have been no worry about this footsore rabbi mounting sweet nothings like, "Blessed be the poor in spirit." Nothing revolutionary about that. In fact, when the reports first came to Caiaphas that there was yet another claimant to be the Messiah, he had just smiled. He'd heard that before, another Messiah, so what? There had been many other men claiming to be the Messiah. Most of them fizzled out within a few weeks. A few had been so foolish as to gather some followers and to take arms up against the Roman outposts. But Rome knew just how to squash these movements, do it quickly and decisively. These stupid little Messiah movements had always been crushed, thanks to that quick, decisive show of force from the Romans. But the Jesus movement did not go away. In fact, it had gotten bigger and bigger. There had been stories not only of teachings, but also of miracles. Supposedly, Jesus had cured diseases and had straightened crippled limbs. Supposedly, Jesus had healed a man born blind. He had given some sight. And the fellow at the pool of Bethesda, why, he had been alleged all through the land. Everybody knew this guy. For 38 incredible years, he bothered the others who came to Bethany for Bethesda for healing. And they say that Jesus cured even him. Caiaphas didn't believe it. He did not believe in Jesus. No special reason why not. He just didn't believe it, that's all. No, he hadn't bothered to investigate. He hadn't tried to find the man and interview him. No, he hadn't allowed himself to think that just maybe this time there was something to this Messiah stuff. So that's not where Caiaphas' mind went. Caiaphas' mind went to his own leadership role. Insofar as he thought about Jesus at all, Caiaphas thought only about how Jesus might have made him look as a leader. To tell the truth, he felt a little bit uneasy with leadership after all. He was never too sure whether people looked up to him or not. He was always listening for the nuances of what they said, trying to figure out whether they thought if he was a good leader. So 2 Sabbaths ago, when his father-in-law Annas had said, "Caiaphas, my boy, that was a great message for the festival of Purim. And you really sang the psalm so well." 2 Sabbaths ago, when he got these compliments from Annas, he had been higher than the proverbial kite. He felt so good, so very, very good to get that compliment. Never mind that it came from within his own family. Being told that he was a good leader was just what he wanted to hear. And it took care of his feelings of insecurity, at least for the moment. But on the other hand, there was the past Sabbath. On this past Sabbath, after the temple service, a man whom he did not even know asked him whether he had been out to visit Lazarus in Bethany. Lazarus? Who is Lazarus? And Bethany, why would he, the high priest, want to go out to this little village in Bethany, a couple of miles outside of the city walls? If someone named Lazarus has business with the high priest, let him make an appointment and come into the office, like anybody else. But the visitor claimed that God's anointed high priest really should make a point to go out to Bethany and interview Lazarus, because, so the story went, this Lazarus had been dead and he was now alive, all because of Jesus. In the tomb for 4 days, all bound up, and now very much alive, because of Jesus. Caiaphas trembled with rage, remembering how he felt that day. There was something in that visitor's tone, something about the way that he said, Jesus brought life to Lazarus, that threatened the high priest. It was as if the visitors were saying, Jesus can bring life, but you can't bring us anything. Jesus can help people, but you can't. Jesus is a leader, and you are not. Caiaphas felt threatened. He just could not bear the thought of losing his leadership role. He couldn't stomach the notion that he, chosen to be the chief priest, the leader of leaders, might be seen as less than adequate. The more he worried about it, the worse it got. What did they think of him anyway? Did they know, did they suspect how uncomfortable he really was with leadership? Did they have any idea that Caiaphas felt stuck with the responsibility of keeping up his leadership image, keeping up the facade that he had to, because of his position in the family and in the community? He had to live behind this mask. Occasionally the priest allowed himself to bring his ordinary, average guy with no responsibility, but to go home after work and eat his wife's good cooking and tuck in his children to bed. But Caiaphas was the high priest, and he had to look the part. Yes, he was stuck in the responsibility of maintaining his leadership image. But wait a minute, what is there to worry about now? It's all taken care of. Caiaphas and the other priests and leaders of Jerusalem had had a meeting right after the Lazarus thing, and they had arrived to a decision. In fact, Caiaphas had bowled them over with his leadership at that meeting. He had shown them that leadership was all about decisions. He could not afford a rebellion of the Jews. He might look as if he was in control of the people. Oh yes, they wouldn't have any problem, no problem at all, because he had learned so much from the Romans. Like a good leader, and others will follow you. Intimidate them, call them names, put them down, and they will fall in like so many others did, like timid sheep. He smiled broader as he remembered that meeting. The others had been wailing about Jesus. What are we going to do? What will happen if we can't stop him? It was not Caiaphas that really knew what to do. It is that he knew he needed to look like he knew. It was not that Caiaphas had thought it out carefully. It was that he knew he must just say something, or else they would think he had nothing to say. And so the others accepted his harsh advice when he said, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have a whole nation destroyed." That he was urging the death of another human began to bother him, just for an instant. That he was writing off Jesus as another troublemaker whose death would buy peace with Rome, it made his stomach churn, but only for a moment. Now, it was better this way, it really was. It was better because he, the high priest, would be respected and feared. If he were to ignore this Jesus, he were to permit this Jesus to get away with what he was doing so well, the people might get the idea that even the high priest had a weak moment and could be pushed around. Caiaphas didn't like threatening Jesus, but he liked even less being threatened by Jesus. So one man can die. So what is that in the long run? Caiaphas sighed heavily. For a moment there he felt it again, stuck with responsibility of leadership, a responsibility he wanted and yet did not want. The heavy knock on the door had the sound of urgency about it, and there was a muffled voice of men in his waiting room. Who in the world would be coming at this hour? Was he always to have to deal with people at any hour of the day just because they wanted to see him? When Caiaphas opened the door, his eyes met squarely the deep, dark gaze of a man dressed in a simple peasant tunic. The man's long hair was matted, and his cheek carried a huge bruise, as though someone had hit him. The man's arms and legs were bound, and he looked so out of place, so miserable, that for a moment Caiaphas wanted to tell him to get out of there. But the presence of several of his guards cut short his words. One of the guards spoke. "Here he is, this is the one, this is the man, Jesus of Nazareth in Galilee." Caiaphas tried to speak. His tongue felt dry and numb. He wanted to ask why his privacy was being disturbed, but the words would not come. The guard did not wait. Taking off his helmet as if a gesture of respect, the soldiers explained, "Sir, you remember you let the order go out for Jesus. We found him in Kidron. It cost us 30 pieces of silver. And don't you know? But it was worth finding out where he was. We took him to your father-in-law as we were instructed, but Annas told us to bring Jesus over to you." 30 pieces of silver, Caiaphas thought. What else could have been bought and would have cut the temple budget to pay the bill with 30 pieces of silver? Why had his father-in-law not just dealt with it and kept him out of it? Why did he have to get involved? Why should he waste his time? Why should he expose himself to this problem? Why didn't the old man just take care of it? Caiaphas realized that he was just standing there, his mouth gaping, staring at the temple guards who had said all that they were going to say. They expected him now to make his move. They expected him to decide what would be done with Jesus. They were trying to stick him with the responsibility of deciding, and he didn't want to decide. The last thing he wanted was to make a decision that he thought he had already been made. Why me? Why now? Why Jesus? An idea struck, a solution, a way to look strong and yet to do nothing, a way to get unstuck from responsibility. To Pilate, to the Roman governor, yes, that is it. We cannot impose the death penalty ourselves, so take the man to Antonia Fortis to wake up Pontius Pilate. Yes, gods, go, hurry, get away. When they turned to go, the door shut behind them. Caiaphas breathed again. Without planning to, he had been holding his breath. It's such a burden, being stuck with the things you don't even know whether you want them or not. Like this job of high priest, and nights like tonight. He didn't want it. Not at this moment, not really. He felt so stuck with the responsibility of carrying on just because somebody else expected him to. Caiaphas turned back. His eyes drew heavy with sleep, but his mind lumbered on. Who will pay the price? Who will bear this burden? I cannot carry these burdens alone. I cannot. Who will pay the price for me? Charles Haddon Spurgeon, the great Victorian preacher, said in a sermon entitled Secret Sins, preached in 1857, when Christ comes a second time, there will be a marvelous change in the way men talk. Methinks I see him. There he sits upon his throne. Now Caiaphas, come and condemn him now. Judas, come and kiss him now. What do you stick at, men? Are you afraid of him now? Now, Barabbas, go, see whether they prefer you to Christ now. All pictures painted about Caiaphas are grim, and I do not believe that he was a very pleasant character. He did not believe in God, although he worked in the temple and he did his duties as the high priest. He did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. We don't know much about the choices Caiaphas made further in his life and whether or not he got to soften his heart and turn to God. Today there are those of us, like the ancient high priest Caiaphas, that feel stuck in the responsibility of the world. We make choices that will make us feel secure because we don't want to put our trust in anything else or in anyone else but ourselves, because then we are not in control. We think we have to keep up our life running the way it is running. We think we have to do the job that we are doing. We think we have to keep up our own appearances. We think we have to look respectable. We have to do it. We are stuck. We think we have to keep our image up. You feel you have to look like the altogether person, when in truth you know you are falling apart sometimes. You feel you have to look strong, because if you look weak, somebody will take advantage of you. You are stuck with maintaining this altogether image, whether you feel it or not. You are doing what you are brought up to do. You're in church because mom and dad took you to church. You are plodding along, doing it right, because it seems to be right. But to hold on everything you can control, all your worldly responsibilities to please other people, leads to a very somber path. A natural example of this can be found by looking at the two seas in the Holy Land. The Sea of Galilee freely receives and gives out water. It has an abundance of life, nurturing many different kinds of fish and plant life. The water from the Sea of Galilee is carried by the way to the Jordan River, to the Dead Sea. By the Dead Sea, it only takes water in and does not give out. There is nothing living, no fish nor plant life in the Dead Sea. The powerful life-giving waters of the Sea of Galilee become dead when mixed with the boarded waters of the Dead Sea. Life cannot be sustained if held on to. Wouldn't you like to be free of the pressures of all the worldly responsibility and choose to put your first priority with God and not with man? Get rid of all the burdens and accept forgiveness, totally free. You have to give it away first before you can receive true living life. If you have never decided for yourself about Jesus, do it now. Have you looked at your own life and said yes to Jesus? Do you realize if you have not said yes, then you have said no? You will not be saved because your parents were saved. You will not be made whole just because you come to church. You will not be set free until you make the decision, your own decision, about Jesus Christ. Do you want to be free? Maybe the first time, or just to recommit and revise your priorities. You can be free. If the Son makes you free, you shall be freed indeed. You don't have to be stuck in the world responsibilities. You can give it all to Jesus, all your cares and worries. You can decide for Jesus Christ as Lord. Lord, how great is your love and grace. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. 'Twas blind to see, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home. Yes, your grace will lead us home. Thanks be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. To him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to the only God, our Saviour, be glory, majesty, power and authority through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore.